Hi, this is Jack Aldane for IR Magazine, and I'm stood here with Andrew Gebelin for Glass Lewis. And I'd like to ask you, Andrew, about the call that has been going on for some time to regulate proxy advisors. What do you say to those who claim that Glass Lewis and ISS have too much power?
Sure. Well, I think one of the things that I would want to say first off is that part of that call for regulation is based on a misperception that proxy advisors are actually determining the outcomes of votes or determining how institutional investors vote. That is actually not the case. Institutional investors come to proxy advisors specifically asking them to implement their own policies and to help them facilitate their voting and engagement activities. So while there is some correlation between our views on some issues, it's certainly not a determinant of any vote. And at least in the case of Glass Lewis, I can say that most of our clients would be using their own kind of custom policies, and they definitely have their own views that differ from ours. They make different voting decisions from our recommendations on a regular basis. So I think it really needs to be addressed that kind of misperception about controlling the vote is one of the things that's driving a call for regulation, which is really unfounded.
Some of the common mistakes you see companies make, what are those? And with regards to proxy voting, in other words, and what do you think IROs could be doing more of in that regard?
Sure. I think the number one mistake that I see is investor relations talking to the wrong people within institutional investors, often talking to portfolio managers about strategy and financial performance, which are very necessary topics, but sometimes skipping over the ESG considerations that actually result in particular voting decisions. So it's very important for IROs to make sure that they are talking to the ESG voting and engagement and stewardship teams, making sure that they're identifying the people who actually make those decisions, and sometimes actually also connecting those people with people at their companies who have greater insight into ESG issues, such as non-executive directors or corporate secretary.
So what tips would you give IROs ahead of proxy season?
Sure. Well, the most important thing is to make sure that you're engaging with shareholders well in advance of proxy season. Most of them will not respond to your requests between March and June, and that's just a reality of the work that they do. So it's very important to have those conversations early and to make sure that you're highlighting if there's a particular issue that you think needs to be addressed because it's unusual, that you make sure that that gets on the agenda as early as possible. Investors will not have time to talk to every company in their portfolio to have a general chat. So those kind of really important issues like changes to remuneration structure or M&A activity, they really just need to come on the agenda as early as possible.
Speaking of highlights, what have been the highlights for you of this conference so far?
So it's great to see that there's a lot of talk about ESG in the investor relations space, because actually I think to date most of that conversation has been fairly high level, and now we're really seeing some discussion about the practical implementation of ESG, both from the investor side and the company side, and I think that's really, really important discussion to have in the investor relations community.
We've just been hearing in a panel about integrating the SDGs into companies' investments, for investors to be aware of this and to understand sort of what the SDGs are and why they are being implemented in company strategies. Where do you see the current stage in the evolution of SDG integration in IR generally? And how do you think that the profession can be galvanized to take it perhaps more seriously than it is at present?
Well, I think from the IR perspective, the most important thing is to ensure that there's consistent messaging that comes from the board level and is integrated throughout the organization at all decision-making levels. It's really not effective for IR to take that on as a task separately, because it just won't get very far. Institutional investors will see through that. And it's important that the discussion is meaningful, identifying SDGs that are actually relevant to the business and to the strategy. And again, for that, you require people at all decision-making levels in the organization, right up to the board.
Andrew, thank you very much for your time. Cheers.